A Sabena Boeing 707 is crossing the Atlantic heading to Brussels with dozens of passengers on board, many of them young, hopeful, and with their whole lives ahead of them. It's just another international flight at a time when big jets stand for modernity, prestige, and the promise of an increasingly connected world. But that morning in Belgium, something starts to go wrong in the final minutes of the journey. What should have been a routine arrival turns into a strange, confusing sequence and deeply unsettling. As the hours pass, this flight is going to leave a huge mark, not just in aviation but also in the history of American sports. February 15, 1961, Idlewild Airport, New York, USA. The sunset is fading over New York as the first passengers board Sabena Flight 548. Sabena Flight 548 takes off from Idlewild Airport in New York, which was the main international gateway to the United States back then, now known as, like JFK. Its destination is Brussels Airport in Zaventem, one of Europe's main gateways. On paper, the route is a classic big transatlantic flight from the early 60s, leaving from the U.S. East Coast, crossing the North Atlantic overnight, and arriving in Europe in the morning. It's a long journey, many hours, connecting two key points in international air traffic, and for Sabena, it's one of those routes that mix prestige and reliability. International exposure. There are 61 passengers on the plane, a mix of people very different from what you'd find today on a major international flight. Among them is a significant part of the U.S. figure skating team heading to the World Championship in Prague. This group makes the flight more than just a simple connection between New York and Brussels. On board are rising stars, national champions, coaches, judges, family members, and team officials. Many of them are part of the present and near future of American figure skating. Having that group on the flight gives it a special human dimension. They're not just anonymous passengers in the sports world. These are familiar faces in their field, up-and-coming names, careers just getting started, and whole families traveling together with a mix of excitement, responsibility, and competitive drive. The plane assigned to the flight is a Boeing 707-329, registration OSJB, one of the big symbols of the modern commercial aviation from the late 50s and early 60s. The 707 isn't just any plane. It's the one that changed long-haul air travel forever, making intercontinental flights faster, more efficient, and way more appealing to both airlines and passengers. Looking at it, the 707 gives off that blend of sleek style and power typical of the first generation of commercial jetliners. With its 4 engines, swept-back wings, and commanding presence, it's something else. On the runway, it became a symbol of technological progress for its time. For passengers in the early 60s, boarding one of these planes was a big deal. Sabena was Belgium's national airline back then, and one of the most recognizable names in European aviation. Its story is closely tied to Belgium's international presence and the growth of air links between Europe, Africa, and America. Like many other national airlines of the mid-20th century, Sabena not only carries passengers and also stands as a symbol of national pride, modernity, and prestige. Flying with them means flying with the airline that carries Belgium's name worldwide, and its operations in Brussels are clearly strategically important. In the cockpit, there are 2 highly experienced pilots. At the controls is Captain Luis Lambret, 43 years old, with 15,384 flight hours. Sitting beside him is First Officer Jin Roy, 48, with 16,231 hours. Both also have military backgrounds, which adds to their expertise. This was pretty common among airline pilots of that generation. We're not talking about a makeshift or rookie crew here. These were men used to discipline, responsibility, and the demands of long-haul commercial aviation. On a transatlantic flight with a Boeing 707, the experience of the captain and first officer is huge, especially during landing and approach, when the workload is at its peak. Alongside them, there are also others on board. Crew members numbered up to 11 in total. Together with the 61 passengers, there were 72 people on board Sabena's 707. Flight 548 finally sped down the runway for takeoff. They lifted off smoothly and began the long journey to Belgium. The Sabena Boeing 707 had already been flying over the Atlantic for hours. No major issues were reported during the transatlantic crossing. The flight went smoothly for about 7.5 hours. The crew started guiding the plane toward Belgium after a long night flight, but at first, nothing out of the ordinary. The 707 slowly descends toward the Brussels area, getting ready to land like so many times before. Gradual altitude reduction, preparing for approach, and full focus on the trickiest part of the trip. But even in this final phase, something worrying pops up. About 20 minutes from their destination, radio contact with Brussels Airport is lost. It's an unusual glitch that gives the feeling something's starting to go wrong. In the cockpit, the morning in Brussels is clear. It's about 10 a.m. The plane is coming in for a long approach to runway 2.0. Everything looks like it's going the usual way for any intercontinental flight. A steady descent, the runway gradually getting bigger in the windshield, landing gear down, and speed under control. The 707 is nearing the threshold at around 900 feet when a last-minute call from the airport controller forces them to abort the approach. A small aircraft is on the runway. Suddenly, runway 20. The plane pulls up and the landing is postponed for several minutes. Up to that point, a missed approach isn't necessarily a big deal. It happens. It's part of normal operations when the runway isn't clear or the crew isn't happy with the approach conditions. But here, things don't settle down. The 707 doesn't just climb, get organized, and come back smoothly for another try. Instead, it starts circling nearby, airport. Witnesses see a plane circling over the field, like there's a struggle inside to regain control of a situation that just isn't coming together. At one point, they try to land again, this time on runway 25, which wasn't even in use. None of this leads to a normal approach. The plane keeps maneuvering, and from the ground, several onlookers get the impression the crew is fighting the plane itself. The big jet makes 3 full circles to the left. As it turns, something starts to visibly go wrong. The bank angle keeps increasing more and more. It's no longer just a plane making a normal turn around the airport, waiting for another chance. It looks like the aircraft's behavior is off, like the correction that should smooth out the turn is late or never comes. The 70 climbs up to about 100 feet, but that gain in height doesn't feel reassuring. On the contrary, it feels like the plane is going up without really being in control. Completely controlled, like the crew was trying to buy time and space to fix a malfunction or partial loss of control that was getting worse. From the outside, the scene starts to look alarming. The plane goes into an extreme, almost vertical tilt. For a moment, its wings level out, but it's not the smooth recovery everyone was hoping for. Right after that, the nose suddenly shoots up. That sudden move ruins any sense of balance. The 707 loses speed. What just seconds before seemed like a still reversible maneuver turns into a critical situation. The plane's energy fades, lift no longer holds it up with any margin, and the aircraft enters a rapid, spiraling dive with its nose pointing down. At this point, there's no time or altitude left to save it. Below, the outskirts of Brussels rush up at a terrifying speed. The plane plummets out of control and crashes into a swampy area. Near Berg, just a few kilometers from the airport. The impact of the crash is devastating. The 707 breaks apart and bursts into flames. None of the 72 people on board survive. On the ground, a farmer is also killed by debris and another worker is seriously injured. Rescue teams arrive quickly, but the fire is already destroying what's left of the plane. Flight 548 is over. In just a few minutes, what seemed like an imminent landing has turned into a disaster, a total tragedy. There's no clear final message explaining to those watching from the ground what's happening inside the cockpit. There's no detailed sequence that lets us piece together, second by second, the pilot's decisions, corrections, and reactions like there is with better documented accidents. What remains is the image of a 70 unable to complete a normal approach, forced to go around, then caught in increasingly unstable maneuvers until control is lost. He completes the battle against the aircraft, highlighting the human cost of the disaster. Among the passengers were many of the names expected to shape the near future of American figure skating. A future that was suddenly shattered on that Belgian field on the morning of February 15, 1961. What happened? What facts did the investigation uncover? The inquiry began amid the charred wreckage of the Boeing 707 on the outskirts of Brussels. From the very start, the Belgian investigators knew they were facing an especially tough accident to solve. The crash was brutal. The fire destroyed most of the evidence, and there were no survivors to help piece together what was happening in the cockpit in those final minutes. Still, the scale of the tragedy demands a thorough investigation involving the Belgian authorities, the US FAA, and the ICAO. It quickly becomes clear the case won't have a simple, clear-cut answer. Even the technical documents from that time, it already gives off that feeling. There are clues, there are theories, there are suspicious elements, but no solid proof that would let you close the case as definitively as you would with other accidents that happened later. That's why Sabena Flight 548 has since been tagged with an uncomfortable conclusion. The loss of control happened for an unknown reason. Even so, the investigators don't just leave it at "we don't know." Their job is to rule out possibilities and narrow down the field. The first step is to determine whether the accident was caused by a purely operational error, a bad maneuver, or crew disorientation. That possibility never completely goes away, but it loses weight compared to eyewitness accounts and the actual sequence seen from the ground. The plane doesn't just seem misaligned or unstable during a normal approach. It looks hard to control, like something was off that kept the pilots from making the aircraft respond in a predictable way. The investigation also considers the possibility of a deliberate act or sabotage. The tragedy had a huge international impact, and according to some historical sources, that theory was even considered at first. But the investigation didn't find solid evidence to support it, so that idea was set aside. It didn't become a main explanation for the accident. As the analysis moved forward, the focus shifted to the flight crew. The Commission believes the most likely explanation isn't a general failure. Not because of engine trouble or bad weather. The weather was actually good, but because of a mechanical failure in some control system that kept the plane from staying within a normal range during the maneuver. That fits better with what the witnesses saw. A plane that hesitates, turns, tries again, goes into increasingly odd attitudes, and ultimately gets out of the crew's control. Within this technical framework, two main suspects stand out. One is the spoilers or related surfaces, the lateral control. The other one, which ended up becoming more significant over time, is the adjustment system of the horizontal stabilizer. The ICAO documentation and later technical references point out that it couldn't be definitively proven which system failed, but the strongest theory was a problem with the mechanism that adjusted the stabilizer, so much so that the FAA considered it plausible that the stabilizer had shifted to an extreme position of 10.5 degrees. Nose up. In a situation like that, keeping control of the plane during the approach and the stall would have been incredibly tough. This idea is especially important because it helps explain the final sequence without just chalking it up to a simple loss of speed or clumsy pilot maneuvering. If the stabilizer shifts or gets stuck in a weird position, the plane can become physically very hard to control, especially during a phase of flight where when the plane gets low, the configuration changes and any front-to-back imbalance becomes way more noticeable. The investigation, without being able to prove it 100%, sees this as the most likely technical explanation for how the 707 behaved in its final minutes. They also looked into the technical history of the model and the airline's own fleet. An ICAO bulletin reported that the crashed plane, along with other Sabena Boeing 707s, had experienced hard spots or blockages in the aileron controls. This info didn't I can't say that was the decisive failure in the accident, but it did support the idea that the investigation was on the right track by focusing on control systems rather than an extreme or purely human cause. The big problem was that none of those clues could be turned into solid proof. The plane was so badly destroyed that it was impossible to pinpoint exactly which part failed first, how it failed, and the exact moment it left the crew with no real chance to recover. So, the official conclusion was careful but frustrating. Loss of control due to an undetermined cause, probably linked to a mechanical failure in the flight control system. And that lack of a definite answer is exactly what makes this case one of the most unsettling of its time. This isn't a disaster where everything clicks into place like clockwork in the end. What we're left with is an incomplete puzzle. The investigators managed to get close. They got pretty close to the heart of the problem, but not close enough to fully commit to it. Do they know something on the plane stopped working right? Do they know the crew was probably fighting a serious, real issue? They know the stabilizer is the main suspect, but they can't go much further than that. Over time, this conclusion has stuck in almost all serious reports about the crash. The exact cause was never nailed down, though the main technical theory points to the tail stabilizer adjustment mechanism. That's how history remembers Sabena Flight 548. Not just as a huge tragedy because of the victims, but also as a major accident from the early days of commercial jets, whose technical mystery was never fully solved. The 1961 World Championship in Prague ended up being canceled. In the United States, the shock was huge. The loss affected not only promising young skaters, but also coaches, officials, and others. Key figures in the development of the sport. Suddenly, an entire generation is cut short. The tragedy also forces a rethink of how American skating is organized. A memorial fund is set up to help rebuild the sports program, and over time, that effort will help the discipline make a comeback in the years that follow. This tragedy also leads to a safety rule that echoes for decades. Never have the whole national team travel on the same plane used when heading to a big international competition. It's a measure born from pain, but also from the lessons institutions learn from these kinds of disasters.